Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 235, The Youth and Election of the Emperor Charles V. The 24th of February 1500 was St. Matthias Day, the day when the ice breaks and the weather turns to spring, at least according to Flemish folklore. At a ball in the palace of the Dukes of Burgundy in the city of Ghent, the heavily pregnant Joanna, heiress to Castile and Aragon, and wife of the Archduke Philip of Austria, had to interrupt her reels. Earlier that day, she had once again put on the holy relic from Lille, the Virgin's engagement ring that promised an easy birth. And for once the relic worked. Joanna's labour was extremely brief, barely enough time to take her from the ballroom to a side room. In some tales it said it was a latrine, where she gave birth to a boy, who would one day rule an empire that stretched from the Philippines to Prague and from Lima to Lauwersoog. Charles of Ghent, as the baby boy was called during his childhood, was Joanna's second child of a total of 6. There was his sister Eleanor, a year and a half his senior, and his younger sisters, Isabella, Maria, and Catherine, as well as his brother, Ferdinand. 4 of these children, Eleanor, Charles, Isabella, and Marie, grew up in the Netherlands, whilst Ferdinand and Catherine grew up in Spain. The two sets did not meet before they were adults, and some never met, even though they lived for a very long time. And that was not the most dysfunctional part of their upbringings. We've already met their parents, Philip and Joanna, in episode 229. They had left for Spain when Charles was 5, never to return. Though Joanna lived to 75, her confinement in Tordesillas meant that all her children, bar one, grew up as orphans. Not only that, these children were the heirs to 4 different European powers: Austria, the Netherlands, Castile, and Aragon. They were political pawns, but at the same time incredibly valuable. Concerns about their well-being, their education, their every move occupied ambassadors, chancellors, kings, and emperors. Remember how we got to that point that little Charles was the universal heir to half of Europe. First, the Habsburgs had almost died out, leaving just one progeny behind, Maximilian. Then the Dukes of Burgundy were down to just one last descendant, Marie of Burgundy. And finally, the House of Trastamara had gone through multiple cycles of intermarriage and extinction before Ferdinand and Isabella brought Spain together and then saw their son, Juan, his son, then his sister Isabella, and her son die. Bottom line, these dynastic lines were already exceedingly fragile. There are studies about the 17th and 18th centuries suggesting child mortality amongst aristocratic families was higher than in the general population. That might have been a function of inbreeding, but an even bigger factor might have been the learned doctors, whose quack medicine probably killed more people than it helped. Fortunately for the majority of people, doctors were expensive, meaning that for once the poor had a leg up on the rich. Talking about doctors, their advice was not only unhealthy, but could even be politically detrimental. In 1514, Charles was engaged to Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. The English king had been urging for a consummation of the marriage at the earliest convenience, but the Emperor Maximilian procrastinated. He had received advice from his physicians that Charles was of such a fragile constitution that immediate sexual congress would in all likelihood be the destruction of the Lord Prince, or else should by that means lose spem proles, the ability to sire children. It seems the fate of Juan of Asturias, the son of Isabella and Ferdinand, who was erroneously believed to have succumbed to the vigor of his bride, loomed large in the minds of contemporaries. So the wedding was held off until Henry VIII lost patience with the complicated Habsburgs and married his sister to King Louis XII, who, to give the doctors their due, did engage in sexual congress with the 18-year-old princess, and only a few months later slipped into the long night. As for Charles' physical health, there are the usual conflicting indications. On the one hand, We have constant panicky reports back to his grandfathers, Maximilian and Ferdinand of Aragon, about sudden illnesses and the need for rest. On the other hand, the young prince, like his father and grandfather, was a passionate hunter and participant in tournaments. It is one of these contradictions that we cannot really resolve. And whatever Charles' actual constitution, Maximilian ordered an armor for him when he was 12 years old, so that he could train jousting and fighting. Now, this super famous armor was actually never finished because Charles grew up faster than the armorers could deliver their work. Passion for hunting and jousting was seen as such a Habsburg trait that Maximilian wrote to his daughter Margaret that he was delighted that our grandson Charles takes so much pleasure in hunting, because otherwise one might think he was a bastard. Physical prowess was, however, no longer the sole objective of a princely education. This is the Renaissance, and a lot more is expected of a leader. Maximilian, who managed the upbringing of Charles from afar, put particular emphasis on the mastery of languages. Given Charles' position as the heir to Austria, Burgundy, and Spain, much of his success depended on his ability to communicate with his subjects. And Charles did ultimately learn French, Flemish, Castellano, Catalan, Italian, and German. But it was apparently hard going. By the time he arrived in Spain, he could barely say more than a few words in any of the local languages. His German remained appalling, much like his Latin. His mother tongue was, of course, the French spoken at the Burgundian court. This is where he grew up, and that is what he saw as his true home. He would later pretend to be more Spanish than any born Spaniard and chose the monastery at Yuste in Extremadura to retire, but the books he read there were mostly in French. His worldview was deeply anchored in the Burgundian tradition, the courts of Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. The great historian Johann Huizinga described this world in The Waning of the Middle Ages as follows, quote, "Their whole system of ideas was permeated by the fiction that chivalry ruled the world. This conception even tends to invade the transcendental domain. The primordial feat of arms of the Archangel Michael is glorified by Jean Molyneux as the first deed of knighthood and chivalrous prowess that was ever achieved. From the Archangel, terrestrial knighthood and human chivalry take their origin, and insofar are but an imitation of the host of angels around God's throne." But this illusion of society based on chivalry curiously clashed with the reality of things. The chroniclers themselves, in describing the history of their time, tell us far more of covetousness, of cruelty, of cool calculation, of well-understood self-interest, and of diplomatic subtlety than of chivalry. War in the 15th century tended to be a chronic process of isolated raids and incursions. Diplomacy was mostly a very solemn and very verbose procedure in which a multitude of questions about juridical details clashed with some very general traditions and some points of honor. All notions which might have enabled them to discern in history a social development were lacking to them. Yet they required a form for their political conceptions, and here the idea of chivalry came in. By this traditional fiction they succeeded in explaining themselves, as well as they could, the motives and the course of history, which thus was reduced to a spectacle of the honor of princes and the virtue of knights, to a noble game with edifying and heroic rules." End quote. Charles' favorite book that he took with him wherever he went and had translated into Spanish for the education of his son, as well as his courtiers, was Olivier de la Marche's The Resolute Knight. This is another allegorical poem like the Teuerdunk. However, here the knight, who is of course Burgundian, goes on a quest, simply on the spur of the moment. He encounters all sorts of helpful figures like a hermit called Understanding, and a palace of love, a guard called Remembrance, and the house of good fortune. But he has to overcome delusion and encounters decrepitude, fights quarrel and age, and so forth. To modern ears it is all a bit contrived and obvious, but then this was the Burgundian culture. The focus was on ceremony and doing the right thing, as in the thing that a noble lord would do. And that is not necessarily the sensible thing, nor the decision that brings the largest amount of happiness to the largest number of people. What is right or wrong is determined by a stringent set of rules that guides the knight to a path that is dedicated to the service of God and the defense of the church. Following these rules and objectives is what preserves a man's honor, which, as Charles would often say, is more important to him than any of his kingdoms. The great chivalric knight was already anachronistic when Charles read these books, though it would still take another 100 years before Don Quixote comprehensively unhorsed him. Charles may be dreaming of questing for the Holy Grail like his grandfather. He was also trained in mundane matters like administration and mathematics, as well as the latest military technologies that were exactly the ones that brought the age of chivalry to its end, assuming that this age ever existed. Charles grew up in Mechelen, as his father Philip the Handsome had done, and like his father, the choice of his tutors and personal staff was a political one. Day-to-day responsibility for the upbringing of the prince and his sisters lay with Margaret of Austria, their aunt and daughter of Maximilian, who was also the governor of the Burgundian Netherlands. Remember that from episode 230. Margaret did, however, refer to her father on many matters, including on matters of child-rearing. Margaret recruited Adrian of Utrecht to teach the children Latin, theology, and philosophy. Adrian had been born in modest circumstances in the city of Utrecht. He received an education with the Brethren of the Common Life, a religious community that emphasized goodwill and the imitation of the lowly life of Christ. They were famous for the schools they had set up. Erasmus of Rotterdam, Nicholas Cusanus, Thomas à Kempis, and Martin Luther all went to these schools. Adrian came to Margaret's attention when, aged 19, he topped the dean's list at the University of Leuven. She sponsored his studies and supported his career. In 1491 he became a doctor of theology, in 1493 vice-chancellor of the university and one of its most revered professors. Erasmus of Rotterdam took his classes and the two men established a lifelong rapport. And when Margaret became governor of the Netherlands in 1506, she called Adrian to Mechelen as her advisor, and in 1507 Maximilian appointed him as the main tutor for the princes. Adrian was a key figure in the life of little Charles and his sisters. As must be clear from what we have already heard, Charles wasn't exactly God's gift to academia. But Adrian found a way to get him engaged with philosophy and theology, even if his Latin never came up to much. Or his Latin never came up to much because Adrian kept translating stuff for him. This combination of pragmatism and intellectual heft is what kept Adrian of Utrecht in the role well beyond Charles' school days. He became Charles' governor of Spain, and finally rose to the throne of St. Peter as Pope Adrian VI. Adrian VI was very much a church reformer. He was appalled by the corruption and greed in Rome. He opposed indulgences and the sale for cash of all sorts of permits and dispensations. His time as pontiff was, however, very brief. After a year and 8 months, he fell victim to the fever that still plagued Rome at the time. He was the last non-Italian pope until John Paul II in 1978. What matters even more than his short pontificate is that he introduced Charles to the works of Erasmus and Thomas More, and might have left Charles V with some sympathy for the reform demands of Martin Luther, a topic I'm sure we'll look into in more detail next season. The other close advisor of young Charles was William de Croy, the Lord of Chièvres. The de Croys were of the highest nobility in Burgundy and had played important roles at the court of Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. William de Croy's father had been instrumental in the marriage of Maximilian and Marie. William himself had been at the court of Philip the Handsome and when Philip died in 1506, William became a member of the Regency Council alongside Margaret, and in 1509 he became Charles' other main tutor. And William de Croy is usually referred to as Chièvres, after his main castle. Chièvres sounds a bit like chèvre, French for goat, which is why he is also sometimes referred to as the goat, though not in the way teenagers use the term today. The relationship between the boy and the 50-year-old Lord Chièvres was extremely close. Chièvres always slept in the same room as Charles, so that the prince had someone to talk to in the morning. Whilst Adrian was in charge of teaching Charles how to be a good person, Chièvres' job was to teach him how to be an effective ruler. Chièvres had come in for a lot of criticism due to matters we will get to in a minute. But he can claim responsibility for Charles' work discipline. From almost the very beginning, Chièvres made sure that Charles read all the documents that were to be discussed in the council. And when he was asked why he had his young charge commit to such arduous tasks, Chièvres said, quote, "My cousin, I am his tutor and guardian whilst he is young. If he cannot handle his affairs by the time I die, he's going to need another tutor, because he's then not properly trained for the work in government." And as it happened, when Chièvres died in 1520, Charles was ready. But almost all the way there, Charles did not appear to be either in charge or capable of taking charge. Most of his youth, he did not say much at all. Various ambassadors sent notes home saying things like, "His Majesty gave audience to anyone, although he did not speak." One writer spent 9 months with Charles on his journey to Spain and had nothing to report apart from saying that God had conferred good customs on the Catholic King our Lord. The English ambassador was even harsher, writing home that the King of Castile is but an idiot and his council is corrupted. Now, the last comment is probably unfair. Charles, even as an adolescent, wasn't an idiot, or no more of an idiot than any other teenager. I think what he was something even more disconcerting. He was just average. He was of average intelligence, average learning, average health, and average courage. Somehow, we should not be surprised that a system that's based entirely on the question who was your father produces someone average. The fact that we now know that behind the pomp and the consequential decisions lurks just an average man is not a sign that the quality of the leaders had dropped since the Middle Ages, but that in the early modern period, information has become so much more abundant. And in the case of Charles V, it is very obvious that what made him such an important person in European history was down to his circumstances, upbringing, and then events, not his ability to shape these outcomes. Which is where we finally get to the politics. Charles' tutors and advisors were not only there to teach the young man astronomy and administration, they were there as representatives of the various political factions in the Burgundian Netherlands. Margaret of Austria and, to an extent, Adrian of Utrecht sought a close alliance with England, the Empire, and Spain in opposition to France, while Chièvres and the majority of the estates favoured a policy of reconciliation with France and neutrality in the broader European conflict. It is a very similar situation to that of Philip the Handsome's rule over the Low Countries, and it is similar because the economic fundamentals are unchanged. Ever since England had cut the supply of its wool to Flanders and started to make its own cloth in competition to Ghent and Ypres, the merchants of Flanders preferred the French and their huge market. Things would slowly shift as Antwerp took over from Bruges and became the entry point for Portuguese and Spanish trading fleets. But for now, Ghent and Bruges, the old economy stalwarts, were the leaders of the estates, and they preferred the French. As long as Charles was a minor, Margaret of Austria could balance out the power of the estates. As governess and head of the Regency Council, she had the last word. That being said, she did not and could not always support her father's political projects without risking a civil war. That sure irritated Maximilian, but he always came round to understand that his daughter was doing all she could to support him. Her position, however, as we said, hinged on the fact that Charles was a minor, something that was always bound to change. And the date for this had been Charles' 15th birthday, aka the 24th of February 1515. But already by 1513, discussions were had about an earlier emancipation of Charles, largely pushed by Chièvres and his allies in the Estates. They even offered Maximilian cash for an early emancipation. Margaret tried to stop her father from allowing her nephew to take the reins, telling him that many are grumbling about us and planting ideas in my lord's mind that are not good for either you or me. Still, Maximilian issued a patent allowing Charles' minority to end early. On January 5, 1515, in the great hall of the ducal palace in Brussels, Count Frederick of the Palatinate read out Maximilian's declaration of emancipation. They brought out the charters on which Margaret's authority had rested and smashed her seals with sharp hammers. This brutal act brought on Margaret's greatest fears. Charles now sided entirely with Chièvres and the local Burgundian nobility in defiance of his grandfather and aunt. What followed was a replay of the fallout between Philip the Handsome and Maximilian. Once again, the differences in economic and political interests between the Low Countries and the Habsburg Empire materialized in a family rift. Charles' policy became much more amenable to French interests, even though, or maybe because, François I had just seized Milan. Maximilian was once again deeply irritated by the reluctance of his offspring to support his wars in Italy. So this is the time when Maximilian came to the Netherlands to personally appeal to Charles and found him cold as a statue. But it can be argued that Charles' advisers were right in keeping him out of the conflict with France. Ferdinand of Aragon had died in January 1516, and if Charles wanted to take over the Spanish kingdoms, he needed France to be at least neutral. Charles arrived in Spain in September 1517. And we've discussed his difficulties with the Spaniards already in episode 229, so there's no need to repeat the details. But the bottom line was that Charles had ceded almost all decision-making to his advisors, in particular to Chièvres and Adrian of Utrecht. And these, being both foreigners and not very interested in Spain, made one mistake after another. When Chièvres placed his nephew on the throne of the Archbishopric of Toledo, both the nobility and the cities lined up against the new regime. On top of all this came the realization that the costs of the hugely expensive election campaign in the Holy Roman Empire would have to be borne by Castile and Aragon. And these costs were truly enormous. At the imperial diet in Augsburg in 1518, Maximilian had negotiated a total payout of 500,000 florins to be paid upon the election of Charles, and a further 70,000 annually from then on, all backed by the credit of Jakob Fugger, which was in turn then backed up by the wealth of Castile and Aragon. But despite these astronomical sums and Maximilian's use of charm and steel, these rounds of negotiations did not end with Charles' elevation. Pope Leo X refused to recognize Maximilian's imperial title, which meant he was still only a king of the Romans, and the simultaneous election of two kings of the Romans was considered impossible. And before Maximilian could muster this final hurdle, he died in January 1519. Now this was a massive setback for Charles' ambitions. By now he had realized not the value of the imperial title for him, but the value it would have in the hands of the King of France, in particular a king of France like François I, who had just recently taken over the Duchy of Milan. And even though his chief advisor Chièvres remained opposed to the election plan, Charles now wanted to become King of the Romans, whatever the cost. So this is where Charles is really gradually taking charge of his own destiny. Not only does he oppose Chièvres, he also brings his aunt Margaret out of retirement and puts her in charge of the finances in the Burgundian Netherlands. But money alone is not everything. Without Maximilian's authority, the French could push the narrative that Charles was, a little boy, a foreigner, who was far, far away, whose Spanish kingdom was on the brink of an explosion and who was of poor health. Against him stood Francois, 25 years old, extremely tall and strong, a war hero who had annihilated the Swiss at Marignano and who could call on all the resources of the French crown. Francois was chipping away at the coalition of electors Maximilian had put together. His first target was Louis V, the Count Palatine on the Rhine. Louis's father, Philip, had been the loser in the War of the Landshut succession and hence was no friend of the Habsburgs to start with. But then affairs of the heart had made things worse. Louis's younger brother Frederick had spent most of his career at the court of Philip the Handsome and then in the Netherlands as a member of the Regency Council. And in this capacity, he did get to know the eldest of Charles' siblings, his sister Eleanor, very well. In 1517, when Eleanor was 18 and Frederick a spring chicken of 37, the two of them became very close. Charles discovered some of the love letters Frederick had sent her and exploded. Eleanor was far too valuable to be wasted on a mere second son of an imperial prince. She was to and did marry kings, not counts. Charles expelled Frederick from his court and banned him from ever contacting Eleanor again. This was of course a snub against Frederick's brother, the Prince-Elector of the Palatinate, and one Francois I was going to exploit. Meanwhile, Pope Leo X had sided officially with Francois, which did have some influence on the three archbishop electors. Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, was never convinced by the idea of a Habsburg succession, and the Elector of Brandenburg was promised a French princess. And Francois was gathering troops on the border. In this increasingly tense situation, Margaret of Austria, now de facto in charge of Habsburg affairs in the empire, thought Charles' election chances had faded away to zero. She therefore proposed to him the following alternatives. His younger brother Ferdinand, the one who had grown up in Spain but was now living in the Netherlands, should become the new Habsburg champion. And if he would be rejected on the grounds of his youth and lack of understanding of German affairs, Margaret suggested Frederick of the Palatinate. Yes, exactly, that same Frederick of the Palatinate, the unlucky suitor of Eleanor. Now this led to one of Charles' fairly frequent outbursts. There's an official document that rejects the plan as it would, quote, make it easier to break apart our common strength and entirely destroy our dynasty. And then there is a private letter to Margaret that is sadly lost, but apparently used somewhat fruitier language. So Margaret responded, saying that, well, if he really wanted to become emperor at any price, well, then he would really have to take out all the stops. He would have to mobilize his forces in the Netherlands and in Spain, as well as hiring lots of mercenaries in Germany. Further, he should authorize his representatives to agree whatever payout they deem necessary, without any prior or later approval. And all payments had to be guaranteed by a German banker, the Fuggers or the Welsers, since no Italian banker enjoyed the necessary credit with the German princes. When Charles complained that the horse he seeks to ride is very expensive, Margaret answered that she was aware that the horse is indeed very expensive, but it is of such a sort that if you do not want it, another buyer stands ready. The cost was not only monetary. Charles had to swallow his pride. And he wrote to Frederick of the Palatinate, the suitor of Eleanor, that, well, he was sort of sorry, and that now that Eleanor had been married away to Portugal, he could only make him whole with a generous pension and important positions in the imperial administration. Meanwhile, the Elector of Brandenburg was promised what Frederick was denied, the hand of one of Charles' sisters in marriage. What swung it was, for one, the support of Jakob Fugger. He did not only fund most of Charles' campaign to the tune of 550,000 florins, but he also refused to honor letters of credit from France, which blew Francois' ability to pay on his promises. Similarly, Margaret had banned Netherlandish financiers from supporting the efforts of the French crown. The other reason Charles ultimately succeeded was the fear that an overbearingly powerful French king would take away their hard-won privileges. The Elector of Mainz implored his brother to come over to Charles' side for the honor of the empire. After almost a year of barter and all forms of skullduggery, where some electors swapped sides 6 times, on January 28, 1519, the game drew to a close. The 7 electors in Frankfurt unanimously elected the absent Charles of Habsburg to be King of the Romans. Charles received these news in Barcelona. Now he needed to get to Aachen as fast as possible. Election was an important first step, but the title was only really bestowed at the coronation. Chièvres, his old tutor and advisor, suggested he should first settle the unrest in Spain and sit down with the Cortes of Valencia and Castile, and then travel to Aachen via Italy. That would require crossing through the French-held Duchy of Milan and hence a renewal of the friendship with King François I. But Charles now had a new senior advisor, Mercurino Arborio, the Marchese di Gattinara for short. He was an Italian, but he had served under Margaret of Austria and had become Grand Chancellor of Burgundy in 1518 and would ultimately become the Chancellor of all of Charles's domains. When Chièvres was focused on the benefit of his Burgundian homeland, Gattinara had a pan-European, a Habsburg imperial perspective. And whilst he understood that the grumblings in Spain could erupt into rebellion any moment, he was much more afraid of a meeting scheduled for the coming year, 1520, just south of Calais, between King Henry VIII and François I. This meeting, well known today as the Field of Cloth of Gold, was intended to be the celebration of an almost unimaginable union, that of France and England. The French Dauphin was to wed Henry's daughter, Mary Tudor. The city of Tournai would be returned to France, and the two monarchs would establish a lasting alliance against these overbearing Habsburgs. Gattinara realized that this could cause some serious trouble, not just in the Netherlands, but to all of the Habsburg domains. Therefore he proposed that Charles gathered a fleet in A Coruña and sailed along the Atlantic coast into the Channel and drop in at his beloved Uncle Henry in London. And that is what they did. After a record journey of just 7 days, Charles V landed in Dover. Henry VIII and his wife Catherine, who was also Charles' aunt, came down to meet the emperor-elect, and over 3 days all 3 of them got on famously. And though Henry went down to Calais to meet up with François I and engaged in some serious bling-off and even a wrestling match with the most Christian king, the Anglo-French alliance Gattinara had feared did not come to pass. Instead, Henry VIII and Charles met soon after the great event in another field near Calais for a much more low-key but much more effective discussion that ultimately resulted in an agreement to ride to each other's defense should François ever go after either of them. And so finally, on October 22nd, 1520, Charles of Habsburg made his grand entry into the city of Aachen. First he paid homage to his namesake, Charlemagne, by venerating the saint's skull, which was encased in this magnificent reliquary another Charles, Charles IV, had bequeathed to the church. The next morning, after more prayers in front of the other great Aachen relics, including Jesus' swaddling clothes, he returned to the cathedral, wearing not his Castilian or Aragonese crown, but the crown of an Archduke of Austria, his way of highlighting his Germanic roots. The coronation ceremony, as devised by his grandfather Maximilian I, comprised all the traditional elements: the oath to protect the church and the empire, the seating on the throne of Charlemagne, the handing over of the insignia of his rank, the orb, the scepter, the sword, and the crown, as well as the anointing and investing. But one new element was added. Pope Leo X has finally dropped his opposition to the Habsburgs. In exchange for a promise to protect the Medici family in Florence, Leo had issued a decree whereby Charles was to carry the title of emperor already from this point forward. That was not yet the full renunciation of the need for an imperial coronation, and Charles would indeed be crowned emperor in Bologna in 1530, but the title was no longer dependent on this ceremony. 700 years of journeys to Rome and the associated political challenges to the emperors had come to an end. And something else had come to an end. The constant shifting of the imperial titles from one family to another. There would only be 2 imperial elections in the remaining 400 years of the Holy Roman Empire, where the crown was contested by anyone who was not the most senior male member of the House of Habsburg. And that was Charles VII, previously being the Elector of Bavaria, who in 1742 found out a little bit too late that this had been a terrible mistake. And then in 1745 it was the turn of Francis I, who was the husband of Maria Theresia. Charles V, in his autobiography, recalls that when several of his ministers questioned the wisdom of taking up the imperial crown, Gattinara summed it up perfectly. Quote, "Under the shadow of the imperial title, not only could Charles serve his own hereditary lands and kingdoms, he could also gain greater ones, enlarging the empire until it encompassed the monarchy of the whole world." End quote. The next thing that our freshly hatched Emperor Charles V did was to call the imperial princes to his first diet. Not, as the Golden Bull ordered, in Nuremberg, but in Worms. And this diet was the Diet of Worms, the one that's going to be the first climax of our next season. That is why I initially planned to end this current season right here. And up until last week, that was very much the plan. But as I was going through the planning cycle for the Reformation season, I realized that after months and months in splendid isolation up here in the attic of my house buried under books, I had lost track of the other kind of seasons, the meteorological seasons. As you can imagine, the Reformation season will be hugely important for this podcast. It will be make or break time. Anyone who has some cursory interest in German history will check this one out before deciding whether the rest of the show is worth listening to. Hence, I had always expected a materially longer research break for this one than I normally need, say maybe 4 to 6 weeks. And if that would start now, that would mean the next season would start June 19th. There's a problem here. A week after that, I would travel to Germany for the History of the Germans tour, and once that is completed, I'm going on an extended summer holiday, sailing across the Bay of Biscay to Spain and back along the Spanish and French coast. Boats and books aren't best friends, nor is recording equipment. And even more importantly, lots of other people are on holiday too, and launching the most important season of the history of the Germans in a time when German towels block the world's sun lounges is not a good idea. So I then went through my skeleton plan for the Reformation season, and there are a few episodes that could be pulled forward into this Habsburg season. I'm thinking namely about one episode on how Charles took control of Milan and effectively most of Italy, one about the life and character of his brother Ferdinand, who is often overlooked but played a much bigger role in the build-up of the Habsburg Empire than he is often given credit for, and finally an episode on the Battle of Mohács and the Siege of Vienna. I know this is not ideal, but it will take us to the end of May, and then the show will go dark until September. I'm really sorry about that. I cannot see any other way. And to be a bit blunt, I've published on average 46 episodes per year for the last 4 years, through Easter, Christmas, birthdays and bank holidays, and I think I'm owed a break. So I hope you will enjoy the next 3 shows, and you will not forget me over the summer.